Last time on the Timeshift.
Let's just say, as a prediction, I bet next week's episode is going to have an environmental tilt towards it. I bet that's going to be the moral of next week's episode, is about, oh, don't destroy the forest, don't destroy the green belt land, or something like that. Which, serious issue, we won't get into that, but still, I guarantee you that next week's episode is going to have a environmental tilt to it. And I'm going to remember this bit in the video, so that next week, I shall introduce the episode with this bit. And we'll see whether or not I was right. I may be wrong, but I may also be right. And if I am, I have no words. Hello and welcome, I'm Chris Hall and this is the Timeshift, my little Doctor Who-y, wibbly-wobbly, timey-wimey vlogcast thing in which I talk about this week's episode of Doctor Who. Now, what you just saw was my predictions from last week about this week's episode. Needless to say, I wasn't looking forward to this week's episode, and, well, this is basically what this little video thing is. It's me talking about the episode. Now, I need to say, before we get into the nitty-gritty of this little review thing that I do, that this is going to be full of spoilers. So if you don't want this spoiled for you in any way, shape and form, maybe you've got it recorded to watch later, maybe you're going to watch it at a friend's house, whatever. If you don't want this spoiled, then switch the video off now. No doubt there are wonderful, brilliant videos to the left of me, which you could watch to your heart's content. There may well be a new video review by me, which you can watch instead. You know, I won't be at all offended if you decide to switch it off, this little video thing. That is, of course, the case. You don't want it spoiled. If you're doing it to be evil and nasty, well then, knackers to you then. Right, so, just a quick, brief little plot synopsis on this week's episode. The Doctor decides nothing. He just appears in the middle of Trafalgar Square. A little girl comes and knocking on the door, and he says, "Oh, who are you?" And she says, "Oh, I'm May," or whatever her name is. Turns out that she is one of Clara's pupils, even though she looks incredibly young to be one of Clara's pupils. And the Doctor tries to reunite Clara and the lost child. But it turns out that the whole world has been engulfed in plants and trees and foliage of varying different degrees. What's going on? Is it some kind of conspiracy? Is it some kind of crazy environmentalist message? Is it some kind of weird, horrible invasion of alien plant men? All of which really would make for far more interesting plot synopses and ideas for Doctor Who episodes than what we actually got, let's be honest. So, with that said, let us get down to the dissection, shall we? This episode is called The Forest of the Night, an episode which seemingly was picked out of a hat at random, as it is probably the most misleading title for a Doctor Who episode I think I've ever seen. And I know this is the internet and people are prone to exaggeration, but let us be honest, there is nothing about this episode which takes place at night, for Christ's sake. It takes place in the middle of the day, for crying out loud. There is no Forest of the Night, it's just the Forest of London and seemingly the rest of the world. Oh, dearie me. Now, how can I best sum up this episode? I know I should really be doing the summing up bit towards the end, but I'll do it now because I've got it written down and I think it's a wonderfully witty little joke, if I ever do say it myself. Well, let us put it this way. Imagine this series of Doctor Who as being a piece of flat pack furniture, and each single episode is a part of that piece of furniture, like a leg or a screw. This week's episode will be very much a foam peanut, as it is so totally devoid of any substance whatsoever, it is mind-boggling. This is an episode which stops at nothing and stays there. This is an episode which seems totally devoid of any kind of purpose to it, regardless of any kind of substance to it. There is no jeopardy, no mystery, no monster. Well, there is a bit of a mystery, but its revelation is just so plainly obvious that it's painful to watch. Now, this whole episode, all the things that are wrong with it, should be one of those classic episodes in which I get very angry at. I start waving my arms and making false accusations about Stephen Moffat and the rest of the Doctor Who crew. However, I can't do that, as the episode as a whole left me with no feelings whatsoever. It was just totally empty. There was nothing which made me angry or particularly happy. It was just a thing, a series of events that whilst they did have connection in the narrative sense, they didn't seem to have any kind of connection to a purpose. I mean, this isn't an episode in which it has a tacked on moral. Like I said in the little clip from last week, I very much thought that this week's episode was going to be some episode about environmentalism, about how we should respect our trees and our forests, how we shouldn't burn them and chop them up, etc., etc. The kind of thing that made Captain Planet crap himself with sheer disgust. However, it wasn't. It was kind of hinted at and kind of hinted towards that there may be an environmental message to it by some of the things that were said and some of the more flippant jokes that the Doctor said. And had this actually had been the case, had it been about environmentalism, had it been about the environment, had it been about something, I would have actually preferred how they tackled it with the flippant jokes and the kind of hints towards it, because then it is then something that we, the audience, can go away and consider in our own time. I very much like that. I hate it when we get moral decisions or moral messages which are forced down the throat. And had there been a moral message to this episode, the way in which they tackled it in that regard would have been great. Something in which I could say, this episode isn't so bad as it dealt with the morals in a way in which treats us like real human beings. However, it didn't. This episode as a whole entity really is just the Doctor and Clara and Mr. Pink and all those ugly little school children walking around the forest for 45 minutes or however long this episode is. At one point they get chased by wolves, at another point there's a tiger, and then a solar flare hits the planet, all the trees burn off and the episode ends. Well, of course, there's a bit at the end which quite a lot of people have picked out upon and got very, very angry at. I haven't got angry about it purely and simply for the fact it's so totally left field that I'm flabbergasted by it. So, the little girl towards the start of the episode whom the Doctor bumps into, who knocks on the TARDIS and says, Miss said that if I was ever in trouble I should look for the Doctor, or whatever it is that she said. It turns out that her elder sister went missing some time ago and it has severely affected her. She is very, very... the only word I can use to describe it is very troubled. She hears voices, and it's something that is very, very much affected both herself and her mother. It's a very difficult time for her. And what do we do at the end of the episode to kind of round that whole story arc off? Her sister returns. She appears in a CGI bush, which magically fades away, and it's happy days are here again. And I don't understand why we needed that bit of closure, that twist to it, because, well, for a start, the whole way in which they deal with this girl and her troubles, I find to be incredibly troubling, as the way in which they deal with it is that, oh, well, you know, hearing voices in your head, that's not mental illness, that is not a horrible condition that you've tragically found yourself in. It's aliens trying to talk to you. So the best course of action is to stop taking any kind of medication that you're on immediately so the aliens can talk to you. Which I find horrible, just a horrible idea full stop. And of course the debates as to whether medication is suitable for mental illness and such is one that is ongoing. I'm not going to get into the nitty-gritty of that. But the way in which they treat that entire case, both the pro and anti it, is a way which is so lackadaisy to the point that it is very, very flippant. And I don't understand why we need to have the elder sister suddenly appearing. I don't really know. It feels as if there was just someone in a script meeting just as they were going through it, and then they get to the end episode and go, well, that wasn't so bad. Oh no! We need a moral! Quick, give me that biro! Let us write something in at the end. Last minute, a bush vanishes and her sister appears. I mean, I just can't get my head around it. Because it is so left to centre. There's no kind of hint that this girl is even alive. But then she suddenly appears in a bush. So what, was she just hiding there all this time? Or is she some kind of strange creation? Because the little girl says, I created this forest, it's all my fault. I wanted to create the forest because I thought everyone would like it. So is her sister at this stage just some kind of creation of her own imagination? And if she is able to create life, that makes her some kind of very small god. And what... Going back to the whole thing of her not taking the medication, just very briefly, one of the things that really does annoy me about it is because mental illness is something that affects 1 in 4 of us at some point in our life. And it affects all of us regardless of what age we're in, whether we are children or adults or teenagers or the elderly. It will affect 1 in 4 of us at some point in our lives. And at some point in our lives we will go through a period of depression. So there no doubt will be children watching this show who have to take some kind of medication to help them with depression or some kind of other ailment. So rather than creating a positive role model for these kids, what they're effectively saying to them is that, oh, the thing that you're going through, that's not what it is. It's aliens. So stop taking your medication immediately, so that you too can talk to the aliens and have a wacky adventure with the Doctor. I know that's not what they're explicitly saying, but that is what, in a way, they're effectively doing, which I just find a very troublesome idea as a whole. Like I say, the whole thing about medicating kids is an ongoing thing. I don't want to get into that for 1 minute because this is just my silly little Doctor Who vlogcast thing. But as a whole entity, as a whole thing, that entire argument, if this is the purpose of the episode, it treats it in a very flippant way. A very, very naive, very, very wooden, woolly-headed way, which I find just so utterly worrisome. And the real startling thing is that, even with that said and done, it isn't in itself something for me to say that this episode is horrible and immoral, because the episode as a whole entity had no impact on me, positive or negative. Maybe if this was an episode like the Kill the Moon episode, which I found to be troublesome to the same degree as I did that, I found that difficult because it was... I'm not going to go back into it because I really don't want to get angry again, but the thing about the episode was that it was built around a moral dilemma which it didn't then see through to its conclusion. And had this episode had a moral dilemma in it, much like the environmental issue, in which whether or not it's right that we chop down trees, etc., etc., or whether or not it's right to medicate children, had that been the whole crux of it, that it just boiled down to a magical bush appearing and that she doesn't need medication anymore despite all the trauma that she no doubt had when her sister went away, and everything is hunky-dory, her sister's back, she doesn't need to take medication because medication is naughty, it stops you hearing aliens. Yay! I mean, if you're going to get into this whole problem, if you are going to get into the quagmire that is this debate, at least approach it in a mature way. Even if there's children within it, even if this is a family show, don't treat your audience so very, very crudely. Don't treat them so very flippantly. Because it just smacks of just a sheer disrespect towards the audience. Which, once again, I didn't find this episode offensive in the same way in which I did find the Kill the Moon episode, because that did feel offensive to me as an audience member. With this, it was just so empty. So very, very empty. Even with the issues with the mental health bit. Which I think says quite a bit about the episode when we get down to it. If even the big controversial topic, even its existence within the episode, doesn't spark debate or make me consider both sides of the argument or walk away from it thinking, well, is it right that we do this or do that? It doesn't. I just walked away from it going, well, Doctor Who's finished. Time for bed. Fantastic. Needless to say that the child actors within this week's episode were pants. There's no word I can really think to describe it, as they weren't mind-gratingly annoying like the young lass that was in the Kill the Moon episode, or those very, very annoying kids in the theme park episode a couple of series back. They were just, much like the episode itself, just there. Every single line they delivered was just flat, wooden, lifeless, and if it wasn't flat, wooden, or lifeless, it felt very much like a stage school darling kind of delivery to it. Which, yes, these kids may be stage school kids, they may well go to their little stage school classes every Sunday morning and put on some really great productions, but in an episode like this, particularly with the characters that are portraying, the sheer lack of any realism to them really annoyed me, particularly as these are kids that are supposed to be in a special needs group. Now, I myself through almost the entirety of my time in primary school and most of my time in high school was in special needs classes because I'm dyslexic. And that seemingly is the same kind of characters which were supposed to be portrayed by the children. However, I found nothing recognisable by them. Of course, many of the people that I shared these special needs and learning support group classes were very rough, and given their roughness in real life, you wouldn't be able to replicate that on a family TV show. But with that said, there was nothing about them that made me believe that they were in a special needs class, that they were children that acted out, bar the silly little sketches that they had to one side. Nothing about the delivery made them feel like real children. Nothing about them made them feel, as many children are in these learning kind of support groups, disenfranchised with the school system as a whole, which is often once you get in these little groups. For most of my time when I was in these groups, you had kids that were playing, that were acting out, that really didn't want to be there, who would try their absolute damnedest to get out of them. And you didn't get that with these kids. They just kind of toddled along and spouted off whichever crappy, poorly written line they were given. Now, not all the lines in this were terrible. Some of them were rather funny, even if they were just delivered in a flat, lifeless way, which really ruined the impact of them, because many of the jokes themselves were pretty funny. And of course, maybe if I saw them written down, I find them more funny than they were when they were actually delivered, but it's kind of hard to really take anything from them because they're just your typical science fiction kid actors. They're just there. They exist to maybe create some kind of sense of jeopardy, which this episode really lacked even with them there. And I really think that there were too many of them. There's at least 6, 7, maybe 8 kids there, and only really 3 of them have anything to say. The girl in the red coat, who was by far the best, though that's not saying a lot. The annoying one with the ginger hair, who really did sound like a stage school darling, and the 2 boys, who I really think you could have just had the one of them, because they were there for the comic relief and they did nothing funny. You could have just quite easily combined them into one character and just had that one character, the annoying one with the ginger hair and the little girl in the red coat, and that would have been it. That would have been perfectly fine. Sure, you'd have to rewrite the episode so it wasn't the end result of a school trip. And here's what's something for it. They're going on a school trip, yet they spent the night in a museum. So you got about 8 kids when only 3 of them, 4 of them really talk. I think there's even more than 8, so let's just say 12. To be economical, probably use less than 12, but whatever. Yeah, it's a dyslexic thing. And of course you've got the mother. You've got the bloody mother of the girl in the red coat. Right, if there's anything in this episode that needs cutting, it's her bits, because we have the bit where she opens the doors like, oh well, I can't get a signal to anybody. It's very difficult, and I don't know what's happening with my daughter. This is such a kerfuffle. Oh, I'm going to give that school a piece of my mind. Then she opens the door. Oh no, I'll call you back. Then you have a bit with her and her neighbour going, oh, this is a right tragedy. This is totally weird. What's been going on? Oh, didn't they get planning permission for all this? Then she's a bit where she's going along in a bike, wobbling about. I mean, is she there for comic relief as well? How many comic relief characters do we need? How many little lighter sides do we need? Because this isn't a dark episode. This isn't some horrible, dark, existential crisis. This is just an episode of Doctor Who in which they walk around the woods and then the episode ends. There's nothing dark or horrible. There's no monsters. There's no dark, creeping, depressing horror lurking in the shadows. There's nothing. So why do we need the comic relief? Why do we need the silly jokes? It adds nothing. And if anything, it takes away from it. Because as soon as we get near something that seems realistic, that seems serious, we have a wacky joke to lighten the mood, which as always delivered in such a flat, wooden, lifeless way. I mean, I just find it is so astounding. And even the Doctor and Clara in this episode weren't that good. Mr. Pink wasn't that good. Mr. Pink in every episode he's been in, I've really liked him. Some people really don't like him. Some people hope they lose him at the first possible opportunity. I've liked him since he first appeared. Bar the tear rolling down the side of his cheek moment, Every single bit liked him. Clara, once again, I never liked her before this series. Now this series comes along, I think she's great. Peter Capaldi is a revelation. He's fantastic as the Doctor. I hope he stays being the Doctor for many years, but even in this, they both felt incredibly weak. And I'm putting that solely down to the writing, as these two haven't suddenly gotten any worse. None of them have suddenly got any worse. It's because they're delivering such horrible material, which they can't really work with. I just find it so... not even upsetting. I feel nothing towards this episode, or any of the characters. Even characters I really like, I feel nothing for. What is going on here? Okay, so I'm going to talk about the special effects for this episode, which feels rather odd as this isn't a special effects led episode like last week's was. But still, I really need to talk about it just to get something off my chest. Am I the only one that found the news footage bit just incredibly obnoxious? I mean, it's the bit where you got the Earth and it's all green because of all the plants. Then you got all the little pictures of news footage floating around. And they couldn't even get the BBC to be one of the little newsreel bits. And it's one of those very annoying things when we have in just about anything, whether it's a movie or a TV show, in which the newscasters are just delivering exposition. With, in this case, with the odd joke thrown in here and there, because we need more levity, we need more laughs, because this is a very serious episode, this. God almighty. It did my head in because it came out of nowhere, and it stayed there, like the girl in the bush. The girl in the bush special effect wasn't up to much. You see these eyes in this very poorly CGI bush, and of course, it vanishes away, and she's just knelt there like, I'm back. I mean, cold blimey. And right at the end of the episode, when the trees are vanishing, it's just a crossfade with a few blinking lights. That's it. Which I find astounding given just how great the special effects were last week, bar the bit when the Doctor's looking through the TARDIS, because of the size differentiation thing. Apart from, I find it astounding that we had such great effects last week and such crap ones this week. It makes the episode as a whole feel very rushed together and just thrown together at the last minute. I don't know. I'm finding it very hard to talk about this episode because not only is it so ineffective towards me, I'm not angry with it. I'm not disappointed. I'm certainly not happy with it. It's just there. Part of me didn't want to do this week's time shift because I had next to nothing to talk about. Because it had such a very little effect on me. But to make matters worse with it, it's just forgettable. That's all it is. Empty and forgettable. Okay, so as an overview, and of course I think you can kind of get where I'm going with this thing, which it was totally lifeless and empty and vacuous and had no purpose existing whatsoever. But it's totally lifeless, totally empty, with no real point of existing, though it is an episode which is perfectly functional. It is an episode which goes from point A to point B without the cameraman falling over or the broadcast cutting out. So with that said, either thing happening would at least add something to the episode. There were too many characters within the episode, many of which were just there to seemingly make up the numbers. I mean, if you're going to have a cast this large, then you kill them off. That's what you do. I mean, it's kind of like with the original version of The Thing from Another World, in which you got about 20 cast members, in which only maybe 3 of them die, but 2 of them were never really seen in the first place, and the last one's the bad guy. With this, you got 8 school kids, the Doctor and Mr. Pink and Clara and the mother, and nothing. Not even the environmental people meet a grisly end. No one meets a grisly end whatsoever. And here's something I missed out previously. They make a joke about Cobra, which is the United Kingdom's disaster committee, and they make a joke about them being inept and the only way that they can think to sort out this this tree menaces to burn them down, which, yeah, ha ha ha, aren't the government inept? Ha ha, isn't Cobra stupid? Which I find a very poorly timed joke, given that Cobra is doing its absolute damnedest to try and come up with solutions to tackling the Ebola crisis, to try and prevent it from taking hold in the UK, and seemingly he's very much leading the efforts to try and to rid the world of it. So to have a joke about, ha ha, isn't Cobra dumb? Aren't they inept? When they're trying their damnedest to stop us all from dying from Ebola, I find to be poorly timed. If this had come out a few months earlier, had this come out towards the start of the year, when Cobra were found wanting, when most of Somerset and the West Country were underwater, then maybe, yeah, then it would have been a time joke. Aren't Cobra inept, as most of Somerset is now looking more like Atlantis than anything else? I just found that a very oddly timed one. Of course, that's just me being a little bit more pedantic, but that's only something that occurred to me whilst I was writing this. Literally within about 5 minutes before I recorded this, that it just sprang into mind. Hang on a minute, they made a joke about Cobra. Aren't Cobra trying to stop us all from dying from Ebola? Aren't they doing a bit of a good job in that? And aren't they trying to lead the response worldwide to Ebola? Aren't they kind of being the world beaters at beating Ebola at the moment? Isn't that a little bit of a flippant joke? I mean, if you're going to edit an episode to take out someone's head getting chopped off, maybe making jokes about the seemingly the one real line of defence that we have against Ebola might be a bit dumb. Of course, I'm getting a bit carried away now. I'm going to stop talking about that now, because it is something that really doesn't need talking about in a show like this. But this episode, which says everything about the episode, I get sidelined about Ebola, about talking about this Ebola, for Christ's sake. I mean, this is an episode which is so soft and so utterly without consequence that they have to have the bit where the little girl's elder sister suddenly appears so we have some kind of conclusion to it. What is this episode really about? It's not about environmentalism, because if it was, it would have been thrown down our throats. It's not about losing childish innocence, because if it was, it'd be thrown down our throats. It isn't about medication, because if it is, it'd be thrown down our throats. What is this episode about? It's not an episode which is monster-led. It's not about some even maniacal alien bad guy. It's not about a moral decision that we've then got to labour on for about half an hour. It's not about special effects, a waggy special effect they've come up with the BBC special effects fault. It's not an episode which is trying to be spooky and failing spectacularly. It's just an episode which exists. It's not it can't be story-led, because you can't have a story-led episode which is so utterly limp and lifeless like this. You simply can't. What's the purposes of the episode? What's it saying? What's its end goal? What's it wanting to do? Of course you can say, well, its purpose is to entertain people, but with a show like Doctor Who, you need a little bit more than that. There needs to be stakes, there needs to be consequences, there needs to be something like, oh, these plants, they're sucking up all the nutrients from the ground and the entire world's going to turn into a desert. Or these are controlled by aliens and the light, it's like Day of the Triffids but with oak trees, or something. You need some kind of consequence to this. You need some kind of jeopardy, some kind of edge. This episode lacks all those things, and which it turns out to just be the Doctor and Co. walking about the woods for 45 minutes and then the episode ends. You can't have an episode like this, you really can't. Not in a show like this. It's a filler episode. If ever there wasn't a definition of a filler episode, this would be it. Because it adds nothing to the overall story arc, it adds nothing to the Doctor Who mythology, it adds nothing to the character development of any one of our key principal cast members. It just exists for seemingly no reason. And it did occur to me before I started recording this that because of the sheer focus which is put on trying to have comic relief characters and wacky jokes and sides and sound effects, that maybe this episode's whole purpose is just to be funny and to be wacky and silly, because looking at the trailer for next week, it looks as if we're going to go down a very dark path. So maybe the whole reason why this episode exists is purely so that when something horrible is happening to the Doctor and Clara next week, that we could turn down and go, well, the Doctor's buggered, but remember when they made that joke about not being able to find the X on a triangle? Haha, what a side splitter that was. And just, here's the thing, It's a stand because had this episode come after the Deep Breath episode, I would have stopped watching Doctor Who. Had it come after the Kill the Moon episode, I'd have stopped watching Doctor Who. Had it not been for the fact that I knew this episode was going to be bad going into it, based upon the trailer alone that we had at the end of last week's episode, I would have stopped watching Doctor Who. The fact I knew about it in advance and kind of prepared myself for it maybe is the reason why I've not gone off on one. That I haven't waved my arms in anger and disgust and said I'm never watching this again and Stephen Moffat's a hack, even though he didn't rate this episode. And I don't think he was involved in the making of this episode to any degree, which may explain why it feels so out there. This is an episode which feels for all the world like it should be some kind of CBBC show. That feels like an episode that should belong in the Sarah Jane Adventures. I never watched the Sarah Jane Adventures, and to be quite frank with you, I never am going to watch them. I have no interest in that whatsoever. Same way I have no interest in watching Torchwood. Spin-offs for Doctor Who, I have no time for them. But it did feel like it should be on some kind of show like the Sarah Jane Adventures, or that weird one that got trailed shortly before it, the Aliens versus Magic or Wizards or whatever it is. Or what. Look, I'm going to be honest with you. Trying to come up with anything for this week's episode, like I said previously, was just difficult. Because there's nothing to this episode. There's bad things in it, dumb things in it, but they only make me angry and make me perturbed outside the episode. Watching it was just nothing. It happened, it wasn't offensive, it didn't make me angry. I didn't get angry at the fact that there was no purpose to the episode. I didn't get angry at the fact that they made a joke about Cobra. They didn't make me angry at the fact that they made a joke, not even a joke, that they treated mental illness so flippantly. It didn't anger me that the children can't act. It just, everything happened. And then the episode ended. And then I walked away from it about 11 o'clock at night and thought, well, nothing else for me to do, I'm going to bed. Some people have really come out against this episode. Some people say it's one of the worst they've ever seen. They speak of it in the same breath as Love and Monsters, which was bad for its own reasons, but it's not bad in the same way that this is. I think this is in many regards, probably is, and I'm trying not to say this, but I think I need to. It may well actually be a terrible episode, but an actual alarm bells terrible episode, because Love and Monsters is an episode that you can get angry about, that you can rant or rave about for hours. The Twin Dilemma, which I state is the worst Doctor Who story ever, I can rant and rave about how awful that is. Kill the Moon, ranting and raving about that. I did that when it came out. This episode I can't do that. It spurred absolutely no emotion in me whatsoever, which at the end of the day probably is the worst thing that any kind of piece of fiction, whether it is television or movies or books or video games, can do. If it is so passive and so utterly unengaging, then it is a failure, a total failure. But with that said, I can't get angry with it, I can't get annoyed by it, I can't hate it the same way I hate Kill the Moon, or Love and Monsters, or the Twin Dilemma. Just... Look, I'm drawing this out longer than it needs to be. You know what I'm saying. I don't like it. I didn't even not like it. It just did nothing for me, which feels a shame, because we're now at the end of the series. This was the last proper episode of Doctor Who for this series, before we get into the two-part which ties this whole Promised Land bullshit into a tight little bow. This was the last independent episode of Doctor Who before the series ends, and it was empty and lifeless. Now, needless to say, I'm really looking forward to next week's episode. The trailer really sold it to me. This is the only episode of this series which I'm going to be looking forward to, it has to be said. If only for the fact that we can now just end the Promised Land bollocks once and for all, and that we can move on next series and hopefully be able to forget some of the horrible episodes that we've had this series. Of course, after the two-parter is done, I will do one final video to sum up my thoughts upon the series as a whole. Of course, I'll say this at the end of the final time shift for this run of Doctor Who, to remind you there will be one more and then we'll be done, and then I'll have to find something else to do on my Sunday evenings. So I hope you found this interesting, if nothing else. Probably not entertaining because I wasn't angry or silly or wacky enough, but it's because of the episode. If you have anything you want to say, anything you want to add, any questions you want to ask me, then just leave them in the comment section below. Thank you for listening and goodbye.